Welcome to Martini Time. It's been a beautiful day here in Blackstone, the center of the world, but then you too are at the center of the world. So, let's follow the Dharma trail that we've been on, and we talked about Shiva the last few evenings, and tonight I want to connect some more dots because this is what I love to do. And the dot I want to connect tonight is the Bodhisattva Quan Yin. You see her here? Now this is a Chinese goddess, and she is sitting on this Chinese inscription of the Heart Sutra, which is the primary sutra or teaching of Zen Buddhism. So how do I get here? How do I get from Shiva to Quan Yin? Now Shiva is an ancient god of, when I say God, I'm not talking about gods, I'm talking about principles of, you could say, spiritual laws that these gods manifest or personify. So Shiva goes back 5,000 years into the Indus Valley, the most ancient civilization, that dates the Indus Valley civilization of India and Mesopotamia, the first civilizations of the Western world, are all happened at the same time. And little statues of Shiva, yogis, were found there. So it's very old, So in India and in China and Japan, you have civilizations that have not been changed. They are ancient. And the gods morph. The gods transmigrate. The gods evolve. So this is why it's been so inspirational to Westerners who discovered the scriptures and the mythology of India and China and Japan, but primarily India, because it's so ancient, and you can see the evolution of gods and religion and philosophy and theories of reality, and all of that you can find in their mythology and in their statues. So Shiva, now Buddha taught. Buddha means awakened, the awakened one, the awakening. And he taught around 600 BC. And he was a Hindu, a yogi. So Buddhism was born out of the yoga tradition of India. And then Buddhism migrated. Now remember, Buddha taught for 50 years, and his teaching wasn't even written down for 200 or 300 years. It was memorized. This was an oral society. So around the turn of the century, Buddhism, now in India, migrated to China. And it went to China around the time of Christ, and it began to morph into Chinese mythology and Chinese mind. And then around 300 BC, AD, Bodhidharma was a Buddhist monk who went to China, and he brought Zen. And so Zen then was born in Chinese Buddhism when it mixed with Taoism, and it migrated to Japan. And now it's migrating to America. So this is like pure yogurt that takes on the flavor of the culture it is accepted in, you see. And the gods change. Now, one of the things about Buddhism is that there are two divisions in Buddhism, and the original Buddhism was Theravada Buddhism, which was called the Buddhism of the Little Fairy. And it was a monastic tradition. If you were going to be a Buddhist, you became a monk. And you lived in a monastery or in the forest, and your goal was to get to the other shore, enlightenment. And if you got to the other shore of enlightenment, it might takes many lifetimes, because they're talking about reincarnation. It takes many times. If you get to the other shore, you don't come back. The whole goal is to get free of death and rebirth and the suffering of life, you see. And that's the little fairy. But then around the time of Christ, Buddhism changed and became Mahayana, which was the big fairy. And here's where Buddhism changed and became more universal. So you didn't have to be a monk in order to practice Buddhism. So the big fairy is that you go to the other shore, and when you get off the ferry, and you turn around to look back at where you were, the river's not there. You were where you started it all along, you see. T.S. Eliot writes about that. You know, the great adventure is to find out, is when you get there, you realize you were where you started. You know, the whole journey of getting to the other shore, of getting to salvation, of getting to the promised land, of getting somewhere in time, when you get to the other shore, it all collapses. And now you become a bodhisattva. Now, a bodhisattva is a person who has had some experiential awakening and stays out of compassion to teach others to the other shore. So the bodhisattva is a spiritual person who has had some awakening of the other shore, and now they become a teacher. So the bodhisattva, now getting back to Shiva, so Shiva migrates, you see, and so when Buddhism happened, you have Avalokiteshvara. Now Avalokiteshvara, I don't have a picture here, but if you look at these Indian abstract pictures of the deities, they have many arms, and it's all abstract, you see. Many arms, and well, just like Shiva here. It's the god of many hands and many arms, and so the statues were very abstract. Now, so Avalokiteshvara, which is the bodhisattva, and bodhi means illumination, and sattva means being, the illuminated being. So the bodhisattva, when the bodhisattva gets to China, the Chinese mind is very practical. And it's not abstract like the Indian mind, metaphysics and gods with 1,000 arms and all that. This is a Chinese deity. It's a human being, you see. And so is this, you see. This is the little wandering Buddha in China. Very happy fella, but it's a human form, you see. So and her name is Quan Yin. Q-U-A-N. Y-N-Y-I-N, Quan Yin. And so this is actually the Shiva, you see, this ancient god here, morphs over thousands of years into this. And then she morphs to Japan, it's called Kannon. I think that's how you pronounce it. But this is the goddess of compassion. Here is another picture of Quan Yin. I prefer this. I love this picture here. But it's the same principle as this. Here is the Christian bodhisattva of compassion, the mother of compassion. The mother, the goddess of compassion. Now, it's strange from my connection with Quan Yin is that a friend of mine went to India 10 years ago, I don't know, I lose track of time. But she went to a monastery, Tibetan monastery, Buddhist monastery on the edge of Tibet. It was in the off-season, and she stayed there for 2 or 3 days. And she found this little jade. See that? This is blood jade. See the blood jade. And there's I thought it was a Buddha carved in there. I took it to an import place, And she said, no, that's Quan Yin. That's Quan Yin, the Bodhisattva of compassion. And the Bodhisattva of compassion is called the listening one. She listens. She listens to your suffering. She hears you compassionately. Now, the Bodhisattva joyfully participates in the sorrow of the world. This is not, she doesn't, like the monastic one, I want to get out of the sorrow. I want to be detached from it. I want to get to some place where there is no sorrow. I want to get out of suffering. But the Bodhisattva turns and goes into suffering and participates joyously in the suffering of the world. And you know what? Where is it? Here. This is the Christian Bodhisattva. Now, but we don't interpret it that way. And I'll tell you the difference. So there's two ways of looking at Christ. There's the one of the suffering. The suffering of Christ. Protestants like that. Mel Gibson's like the passion of Christ, the suffering, the torture. Oh my God, the suffering, you see. And this is, but then there is the triumphant Christ. The triumphant Christ is dressed in, I don't have a picture of it, but he's dressed in a tunic. And his eyes are open. And he's joyously hanging from the cross. In other words, he goes to the crucifixion, which is a metaphor for the sorrow of life. Now you remember when we talked about Shiva as being a vision of destruction. Shiva is always the god of death. You see, Shiva, you're going to die. Shiva's death. Shiva's when the doctor calls and says you got cancer. You got 3 weeks. That's Shiva. That is the destruction of life. The destruction, the horror. That's the apocalypse. In Apocalypse Now, when Captain Kurt says, the horror, Shiva, the horror, you see. Life, eating life, you see. And so the triumphant Christ doesn't run from that. He turns and goes into it. He willfully goes to the cross, which is a symbol for the suffering of life, which is a symbol for Shiva. So when Shiva says, you see all that suffering? You see that you're going to die? You see that suffering? Wait, you see. And then this hand here points to this foot here. It's liberated. And it points to, and it says, well, how do you get liberated from suffering? The still face of Shiva says, you enter into it. And so all of this messages here are basically the same theme in different cultures and different ways of looking at it. So the Bodhisattva, the compassionate goddess of suffering, who listens, who stays with you, who sits by your bedside, who sits in your heart, you see, and joyfully engages you in your suffering. Now I guess I'll share this with you, but I had an experience, and that's the reason I had this right here, is because when I learned that I had Quan Yin hanging around my neck, I thought, well, maybe I got to find out who this Quan Yin is. So I, did a little research, and I found the chants of the Heart Sutra on YouTube. And there's a particular chant by Moe, Chinese chant in Sanskrit, and I started playing it. And when I first heard this chant, my heart opened up and it began to squeeze like an accordion, squeezing joy and sorrow. And it went on and on and on. And I was saying, oh, stop, but don't stop. Stop, but don't stop. You see, on and on and on. Quan Yin's hands were squeezing my heart. So the participation in life is a union of joy and sorrow as one. We like to separate it. Whoa, joy is over there, sorrow is over there. I want to get to joy. I want to get away from sorrow. We separate it. Put a big gap between it, you see. And we do that with the resurrection. So the Christ, you see, the sorrow of Christ then, and then then in 3 days he's resurrected. Oh, I'm free from it, you see. But in the Bodhisattva, they're the same. The liberation and the suffering is the same thing. So in Buddhism, when the Bodhisattva goes to the other shore and then turns around and sees that there was no river, that there is no other shore. So this Buddhism doctrine is that heaven and hell are the same. Nirvana, the other shore, and samsara, the wheel of suffering, is the same. Is the same. Heaven and earth are the same. They're not separated. Joy and sorrow is the same. It's not separated. Life and death is the same. It's not separated. There's no gap. There's no time. There's no, I got to get from here to there. It's now. So the joy and sorrow, life and death is now. But we can't find it because we separate it and chase it in the future. So the Bodhisattva is that person who turns and embraces their life like Zorba. Embraces their life like a dance. I dance in the sorrow. I dance on death. I dance on suffering. And because I am no longer separated from life, I'm joyous. I am joyous because I'm no longer separated from life. And that is the song or the dance of the Bodhisattva, and also of the triumphant Christ, who willfully goes to the suffering of life and then dances with it and embraces it, you see. So that's how it becomes a portal. If you understand the portal, the gateway, the gateless gate. You see, so all of these great religious traditions all come to the same, they're all spokes on the same wheel. But you have to connect the dots. You have to give up your, oh, that's just paganism, or that's just, my spoke is the only spoke. That's suffering. That's dividing reality. So anyway, thanks for dropping in. Thank you.